On a calm, sunny afternoon in the small town of Ridgewood, Jake Bennett, a 28-year-old man, had just married the woman he loved. His bride, Margaret Lewis, was 52, and the mother of his best friend, Josh. The wedding had been a shock to everyone, from family to neighbors, and whispers echoed through the town as people struggled to make sense of the unusual union. Despite the controversy, Jake and Margaret were ready to start their new life together. They had met through Josh years earlier when Jake and Josh were inseparable. Over time, Margaret and Jake formed a deep connection, evolving from friendship into a romance that led to marriage. But just days after the wedding, tragedy struck. Jake was found dead in their home, sending shockwaves through the community. Who would want to kill Jake? Could his unusual marriage have played a role in his death? What had started as a joyous occasion now marked the beginning of a dark, twisted investigation. 4 days after the wedding, the quiet town of Ridgewood was shaken. Margaret's neighbor, Mrs. Collins, noticed something unusual. Margaret, usually seen early in the morning, wasn't tending her garden or walking her dog. Growing concerned, she knocked on the door but received no response. Margaret's car was still in the driveway, so Mrs. Collins called the police. Officers arrived and forced entry into the eerily quiet home. Inside, they made a grim discovery. Jake's body lay motionless in the master bedroom. Blood pooled beneath him, staining the floor. It was immediately clear that this was no accident. Jake had been brutally attacked. There were no signs of forced entry, leading investigators to believe the killer was either let in voluntarily or already had access to the home. Margaret was nowhere to be found. The once peaceful neighborhood was now buzzing with police activity. Ridgewood's tight-knit community was in shock, and the search for answers had only just begun. With Jake's body now the center of a growing crime scene, detectives turned their attention to Margaret. Where was she? Why wasn't she home? Did she know what had happened to her husband? These were the questions swirling in Detective Olivia Harper's mind as she led the investigation. The lack of forced entry suggested Jake or Margaret had likely opened the door for their killer. The house wasn't ransacked, eliminating robbery as a motive. Whoever did this had one purpose: to kill. As officers canvassed the neighborhood, Mrs. Collins recalled hearing a loud thud the night before but thought nothing of it at the time. Detectives combed through the home for clues. The living room was immaculate, and the master bedroom where Jake's body was found was starkly different. Blood soaked the carpet, suggesting a violent confrontation. The medical examiner quickly determined Jake had been stabbed multiple times, with a deep chest wound being the fatal blow. No defensive wounds indicated he hadn't seen the attack coming. While searching the bedroom, Harper's partner, Detective Sam Ellis, noticed something odd. An untouched glass of wine sat on the bedside table next to an open book with a bookmark neatly placed. The scene felt off. The killer seemed composed, calm even, amidst the violence. Margaret's disappearance became more suspicious by the minute. Detectives reached out to Margaret's friends. One close friend, Linda, revealed that Margaret's relationship with Jake had strained her relationship with her son, Josh. Josh couldn't accept his best friend dating his mother, Linda explained. He stopped talking to her altogether. As detectives dug into the couple's background, they discovered that just days before the wedding, Jake and Margaret had taken out a life insurance policy, naming Margaret as the sole beneficiary. This raised red flags. Was Margaret involved in Jake's murder, or was she in danger herself? The team now faced two possibilities. Either Margaret was a victim, or she had a role in Jake's death. With no signs of her leaving town and no reports from local hospitals or friends, detectives knew finding Margaret was crucial to solving the case. As the search for Margaret extended into the following day, the complexity of the case deepened. Suspicions swirled around the life insurance policy, yet detectives lacked solid proof connecting Margaret to Jake's murder. The key to unlocking the truth seemed to lie in finding her. Meanwhile, Detective Harper delved further into Josh's background. His extreme reaction to the marriage was troubling, but just how deep did his resentment go? Investigators unearthed a history of Josh's volatile behavior. A year prior, he'd been involved in a bar fight, triggered by a comment about his mother. Witnesses recalled Josh flying into a rage, injuring two men before security intervened. Harper decided to bring Josh in for questioning. Disheveled and defensive, he sat across from her with closed-off body language. When asked about his relationship with Jake and his mother, Josh tersely responded, "I hadn't spoken to them in months. They were adults. They did what they wanted. I didn't care." Yet Harper sensed an undercurrent of bitterness. When pressed for an alibi, Josh hesitated. He claimed to have been out of town the night of the murder, but failed to provide any convincing details. His alibi was crumbling. Harper shifted her strategy. "You don't have to protect her," she said softly. "If your mother's involved, you don't need to take the blame." Josh's eyes briefly widened before he regained composure. "I don't know where she is," he said coldly. "She's probably hiding somewhere, but I had nothing to do with it." While it wasn't the confession Harper had hoped for, it raised fresh suspicions. Why would Margaret be hiding? Was Josh deflecting suspicion, or was there something darker between mother and son? With forensic teams combing the house and leads growing more urgent, Ridgewood became the epicenter of a chilling murder mystery. Then the next day, a discovery upended everything. The following morning, Harper received an urgent call. Margaret's car had been found abandoned at a local park on the outskirts of town. Harper and her team raced to the scene, hoping for a lead on Margaret's whereabouts. The park, secluded and surrounded by dense woods, usually exuded a peaceful air, but today it felt ominous. Margaret's silver sedan was parked neatly in a far corner of the lot, its doors locked, windows rolled up, as if she had simply walked away. But where had she gone? And why here? Harper instructed the forensic team to search the vehicle for clues. As they worked, she circled the car, scanning for anything unusual. She didn't have to look long. Just a few feet from the car, Harper spotted a single high-heeled shoe lying on its side, partially buried in the dirt. It was a striking clue. Something had gone terribly wrong. "Bag it," she directed one of the techs, her mind racing. "We need to figure out if she walked away or if someone took her." Officers spread out, combing the dense woods behind the parking lot. For an hour, there was no trace of Margaret. Harper's frustration mounted. There had to be something. Footprints, discarded items, anything. Then one of the officers radioed in, his voice crackling with urgency. "We found something!" Harper rushed to the scene where two officers stood over what appeared to be a shallow grave. The disturbed earth concealed a black handbag, Margaret's. Harper's stomach churned as she knelt beside the grave. It was clear this was meant for something or someone. But who had dug it? And where was Margaret? The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. Margaret was no longer just missing. She could be in grave danger, or worse, already a victim. Her handbag discarded, it was clear she hadn't left voluntarily. Whether she'd been taken or met someone here, the detectives couldn't yet say. But one thing was certain, this case had just taken a far darker turn. The discovery of Margaret's abandoned car and the shallow grave sent a chilling wave through the investigative team. As the forensic team carefully unearthed the bag, Detective Harper knew they were closing in on something. Whether it was finding Margaret or uncovering more dark truths about what had really happened between her, Jake, and Josh. The contents of Margaret's handbag offered little help. A few personal items, a wallet, some makeup, and a cell phone that had long been powered off were all they found. But it wasn't what was inside the bag that concerned Harper. It was the fact that the grave was there at all. Someone had clearly prepared it for a body. Whether it was Margaret's or someone else's remained to be seen. Harper couldn't help but wonder if this was a staged disappearance. Was Margaret trying to fake her own abduction? Or had someone else planned to bury her there? As these questions circled in her mind, she knew the only way to find answers was to continue digging into the tangled relationships surrounding this case. Back at the station, Harper and her partner, Detective Ellis, sat down with Josh once more. This time, their approach was different. They had too many unanswered questions, and Josh, whether he realized it or not, was at the center of most of them. Harper laid out the facts for him. His mother was still missing, and now a shallow grave had been found near her car. Josh's expression flickered with shock, though it was hard to tell if it was genuine or forced. "A grave?" he muttered, his voice low and uneasy. "What does that have to do with me? I already told you I haven't spoken to her or Jake in months." "You say that," Harper replied calmly, "but the timeline isn't adding up, Josh. We know that you were seen near the house just a few days before the wedding, and now we find your mother's car abandoned and a grave dug in a park. If you had nothing to do with this, why is all the evidence leading back to you?" Josh shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The room felt thick with tension as he wrestled with his thoughts, trying to maintain his cool. "I didn't do anything," he said again, though this time with less conviction. "I hated what they did, yeah. Jake marrying my mom? It was disgusting. But I didn't hurt him, and I didn't do anything to her." Detective Ellis leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. "Then help us understand, Josh. If you didn't have anything to do with this, why were you near the house? Why is Margaret missing? You said yourself that you hadn't spoken to her in months, but witnesses saw you on the street around the time of the murder. If you're innocent, this is your chance to clear it up." Josh's face darkened. He stared at the table in silence, avoiding the detective's eyes. His hands clenched into fists, a clear sign that he was growing more agitated. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. I just wanted to talk to her," Josh finally admitted, his voice shaky. "I wanted to convince her to end it, to tell Jake it was a mistake. I thought if I could make her see reason, everything would go back to normal. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Harper felt a shift in the room. Josh was finally cracking under the pressure, and this was the moment she needed to dig deeper. "What happened, Josh? What did you do when you went to see her?" Josh took a deep breath, his eyes filling with frustration and regret. "I didn't even make it inside," he said. "I stood outside the house for a while, watching. I saw them through the window, laughing, drinking, like everything was perfect. I lost it. I wanted to storm in and tear it all apart, but I couldn't. I couldn't face them. So I left." Harper studied him closely, trying to gauge the truth in his words. "Did you go back that night?" Josh shook his head vehemently. "No, I swear. I never went back after that. I went home, and I stayed there. I couldn't handle seeing them together." Harper leaned back, considering his words. While Josh's story had some truth to it, there were still too many holes. If he had left, why had neighbors reported seeing his car later that night? Why was there evidence pointing to his involvement? "We're going to need more than just your word," Harper said calmly. "We need proof. Where were you the night Jake was murdered? Can anyone vouch for you?" Josh was silent again, his eyes downcast. "I told you. I was alone." The room fell quiet once more, tension hanging in the air like a thick fog. Harper knew they weren't getting the full story, but Josh wasn't going to give them anything else. Not yet. She stood up and motioned for Ellis to follow her out of the room. As they stepped into the hallway, Harper turned to Ellis. "He's lying about something," she said firmly. "He was there that night. I can feel it." Ellis nodded in agreement. "We just need to find out what he's hiding and why. He might not have pulled the trigger, but he knows more than he's letting on." With Josh now firmly in their sights, Harper and Ellis returned to their office. The search for Margaret continued, but now more than ever they needed to uncover the truth before the case took another deadly turn. With Josh's evasive answers and mounting suspicion, Detectives Harper and Ellis knew they were getting closer to the truth, but they needed more evidence to crack the case wide open. The discovery of the shallow grave and Margaret's abandoned car had shifted the investigation into high gear. It was clear that someone had planned to bury more than just secrets in that park. Forensics continued their meticulous search of the scene, but the detectives weren't content to wait. Harper decided it was time to follow up on some of the leads that had been forming since the investigation began. One key detail that hadn't yet been explored fully was the couple's life insurance policy. A quick call to the insurance company confirmed their suspicions. Jake had taken out the policy just days before the wedding, and Margaret was indeed the sole beneficiary. While this alone wasn't enough to implicate her, it certainly painted a darker picture of the situation. As Harper hung up the phone, she received another update. Margaret's phone had finally been cracked, and the tech team had recovered deleted messages. What they found would change everything. Margaret had been exchanging messages with an unknown number in the days leading up to Jake's murder. The messages were cryptic, but they clearly showed that Margaret was involved in something much bigger than a typical marital dispute. One message in particular stood out. "It's done. He won't bother us anymore." The timestamp on the message placed it just hours before Jake's murder. Margaret's phone had sent the message, but to whom? And what exactly had been done? The detectives now had more questions than answers. But one thing was certain, Margaret wasn't just an innocent bystander. She was involved and possibly orchestrating the entire thing. Harper immediately cross-referenced the phone number with known associates of Margaret, but there was no match in the system. However, further investigation into Josh's phone records revealed something startling. The unknown number was also linked to him. Suddenly, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Josh and Margaret had been in contact the entire time, despite his claims that they hadn't spoken in months. The messages between Josh and Margaret were brief but telling. They had discussed their plans cryptically, and the timing aligned almost perfectly with the events leading up to Jake's murder. It was becoming clear that both mother and son were deeply involved in this dark conspiracy. Harper's mind raced as she pieced together the timeline. It seemed that Josh's resentment over his mother's relationship with Jake had boiled over. But this wasn't just about anger or jealousy. There was a financial motive as well. The life insurance payout, combined with the potential for a fresh start, was more than enough to drive Margaret and Josh to act. But had they planned to murder Jake from the beginning, or had things spiraled out of control? As Harper and Ellis prepared to bring Josh in for another round of questioning, the forensic team made a critical discovery. In the trunk of Margaret's car, they found traces of blood. The sample was sent for immediate analysis, and within hours, the results came back. Jake's blood. The evidence was damning. Josh and Margaret had not only been working together, but they had likely transported Jake's body themselves. The shallow grave, the cryptic messages, the blood in the car, it all pointed to a calculated plan that had gone terribly wrong. But where was Margaret? And why hadn't she been seen since the night of Jake's murder? Detectives Harper and Ellis rushed to confront Josh with the new evidence. This time, they weren't going to let him slip away. They found him at his apartment, looking more disheveled than before, as if the weight of the investigation was starting to crush him. When Harper and Ellis entered the room, they wasted no time. "We know you were working with your mother," Harper began, her voice steady but firm. "We have the messages, the blood in the car, and the grave. You need to tell us where she is, Josh. This is your last chance to come clean." Josh's face turned pale and his hands began to shake. For a moment, it looked as though he might deny everything again. But the overwhelming pressure of the situation finally broke him. His voice was barely above a whisper as he began to speak. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," Josh admitted, tears welling in his eyes. "It was supposed to be simple. Just scare him, make him leave. But my mom, she wanted more." Harper and Ellis exchanged glances. Sensing that they were about to uncover the full truth, Josh continued, his voice trembling. "We argued. She was so mad at Jake. She said he was just using her, that he didn't really love her. And she told me that we could start over if he was gone. I didn't know what she meant at first, but then she told me about the insurance money." Harper felt a chill run down her spine. Everything was starting to make sense, but there were still missing pieces. "What happened that night, Josh? Did you kill Jake?" Josh's face crumpled as he broke down completely. No, I swear I didn't kill him. I was there, but I didn't do it. I just couldn't stop her. She told me to help her clean up, to hide everything. She said no one would find out. We dug the grave, but we couldn't bury him. She freaked out and left. I don't even know where she went after that." The room was silent for a moment as the gravity of Josh's confession sank in. Margaret had masterminded the murder, and Josh had been her unwilling accomplice. But Margaret was still out there somewhere, and she had to be found before anyone else got hurt. Josh's confession had finally provided the missing pieces of the puzzle. But it wasn't over yet. Margaret was still out there, and now she wasn't just a grieving widow, she was a fugitive. Detective Harper knew time was running out, and they needed to find her before she disappeared for good or worse, took more drastic actions. Harper and Ellis had heard it before. Cornered suspects rarely went quietly. Josh had given them enough details to work with. He explained that after the murder, Margaret had become increasingly paranoid. She feared the police would catch on to their plan and that the insurance money wouldn't be enough to buy them freedom if they were caught. In the days leading up to her disappearance, she had become more erratic, and Josh admitted he was scared of what she might do next. He knew she was desperate and capable of more violence. Harper's first step was to track Margaret's last known movements. The discovery of her car and the shallow grave had already pointed to her fleeing the scene in haste. But there had to be more. A deep dive into her phone records and credit card transactions finally revealed a lead. Margaret had withdrawn a large sum of money from a local bank the day after Jake's murder, and it looked like she was preparing to disappear. The detectives quickly traced the transaction to a hotel just outside of Ridgewood, a secluded spot far enough from the town that Margaret might think no one would find her. Harper and Ellis wasted no time. Armed with a warrant, they gathered a team and headed to the hotel, hoping this was the final piece in their long chase. The hotel was run down, the kind of place where people could disappear without a trace. As they approached the front desk, the clerk barely looked up from his magazine when they showed him Margaret's picture. He didn't recognize her at first, but as Harper pressed, he finally remembered. Yeah, she checked in a couple days ago. Paid in cash. She didn't say much, just asked for a room in the back. Harper's heart raced. They were close, so close. She asked for the room number, and the clerk pointed them down a dimly lit hallway. As the team made their way down the corridor, Harper motioned for everyone to proceed cautiously. Margaret had already proven she was capable of violence, and if she felt cornered, things could turn deadly fast. They reached the door, room 12. Harper signaled for the officers to take position. With her gun drawn, she knocked on the door, her voice calm but authoritative. Margaret Lewis, this is the police. We know you're in there. Open the door, and no one else needs to get hurt. There was no response. Harper knocked again, harder this time. Margaret, we know what happened. It's over. You need to come out. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then a faint shuffling sound came from inside the room. Harper signaled the team, and within seconds, the door was kicked open. The officers stormed inside, their guns raised. What they found was Margaret, sitting on the edge of the bed, her eyes hollow and distant. In her lap was a small handgun, her fingers wrapped tightly around the grip. She looked up at the officers, her expression blank, as if the weight of everything had finally crushed her spirit. Margaret, put the gun down, Harper said, her voice steady but firm. It's over. There's no way out of this. For a moment, Margaret didn't move. Her eyes flickered, her mind clearly racing through the possibilities. But there was no escape left, and deep down, she knew it. Slowly, she let out a heavy sigh, her shoulders slumping in defeat. With a trembling hand, she lowered the gun and placed it on the bed beside her. As the officers moved in to handcuff her, Harper could see the weight of the situation finally sinking in. Margaret had gone from a doting mother and newlywed to a woman on the run, entangled in a crime that had spiraled out of control. Once in custody, Margaret was silent as they led her out of the hotel and into the waiting patrol car. The reality of her situation was beginning to set in, and there was no longer any defiance in her eyes, just exhaustion and regret. She didn't fight, didn't resist. It was clear she knew the end had come. Back at the station, Margaret sat across from Harper in the interrogation room, her hands cuffed in front of her. For the first time since the investigation began, she looked truly defeated. Harper didn't waste time. She wanted the full story. Why, Margaret? Harper asked, her voice quiet but firm. You had everything. Your son, a new life with Jake. Why did it have to come to this? Margaret stared at the table, her voice barely a whisper. Jake wasn't who I thought he was. At first I loved him, but then I realized he only wanted the money. He was going to leave me. Harper's brow furrowed. So you killed him? You could have walked away, Margaret. Why didn't you just leave? Margaret's voice cracked, her eyes welling with tears. I couldn't. I couldn't let him ruin everything. Josh hated me for what I did, but he's all I had left. I thought if we got rid of Jake, we could start over. Harper sat back, understanding at last. This wasn't just about love or jealousy. It was about desperation. Margaret had seen Jake as her last chance at happiness, and when that fell apart, she became consumed by fear and the need for control. But in the end, she had lost everything. As Margaret was led back to her cell, Harper and Ellis sat in the quiet of the station, reflecting on the twisted, tragic events that had unfolded. The case was finally closed, but the damage left in its wake would linger for years to come. Ridgewood, once a quiet town, would never be the same again. The tragic story of Jake's murder, a tangled web of deceit, jealousy, and greed, had finally come to an end. Josh's involvement as an accomplice, Margaret's desperate need for control, and the life that was lost all painted a haunting picture of how far people would go when pushed to the brink. But in the end, justice was served, and the town of Ridgewood could finally begin to heal.